Well, thank you very much. This is the first discussion since Brian Crowley has joined us to say that we are now changing the whole conversation. So there's a lot of pressure on these two gentlemen. But I'm also very much aware that here in Washington, we don't listen to Canada enough. And I have Canadian relatives. I mean, my relatives go back 400 years to North America, and they were working in the Hudson Valley. So I have lots of Canadian relatives, and I still don't understand the Canadians. And especially when you're dealing with a complex issue like Canada-China relations and US-China relations. So let's turn first to Charles, maybe for some opening comments about how you see this unfolding relationship with the China question from Canada. And then we'll turn to Miles for an opening short statement, and then we'll have a conversation that will hopefully open up to the floor as well. Thank you, Charles.
Well, I think that, traditionally Canada, elements within Canada, not myself, have established a moral equivalence between the two superpowers of the United States and China. And so, within the Canadian Foreign Ministry, they refer to our policy to China as engagement and strategic empathy. And what this has really meant is a very high degree of elite capture among the Canadian policymakers, and a reluctance to engage in measures that the United States and our like-minded allies would like to see to counter China's strategic rise. I mean, we don't have any equivalent of the Foreign Agents Registry Act, so there are a number of influential Canadians, or perhaps Canadians who, after retiring from a position of public trust where they were not identified as being active in countering China's threat, are rewarded royally with law firms and board memberships that they wouldn't get if they had stuck their necks out and said the right thing. And we don't have effective legislation against the transfer of classified or dual-use technologies to agents of a foreign state. So Canada has been open country for China sending, for example, PLA researchers into Canadian labs to obtain these materials. Just last week, there was a report in the Canadian newspaper that Huawei continues to have extensive relationships with Canadian labs working in areas of interest to the Chinese state, giving some limited funding to those labs on the condition that the patents for the dual-use technologies revert to Huawei. So, we do have a problem here, and I think from the US point of view, one might look up to the north, where China regards itself as a near Arctic state and talks about the polar Silk Road. But if you move down a bit further, there's also a great deal of Chinese interest in critical minerals, rare earths that are under the ground in Canada and which need funding to be extracted. And China's desire to gain a monopoly or coercive control over these things so essential to our high-tech future, I think should be of concern to the US. In fact, about a year ago, Secretary of State Blinken was in Ottawa and suggested that it was time for a US-Canada strategic dialogue on Indo-Pacific. And then nothing much happened until Mr. Biden showed up a few months later, and then Canada issued a statement on Indo-Pacific strategy. And in that statement, China is defined as an increasingly disruptive global power, which, disruptive is rather weak language, I think, compared to how I regard it. But I was in the Canadian Foreign Ministry a few weeks ago and met with a senior official dealing with our China policy. And I said, well, how are we responding to this new definition of China as not our not our target for engagement and strategic empathy, but disruptive power, to which he said to me, well, disruption is not necessarily a bad thing. When the internet came out, that was disruptive too. We're focused on engagement. So I do think that one has to be aware that there is an issue up at Canada that does present strategic threats to the United States because of the dual-use technologies going out. The enormous Chinese diplomatic cohort in Canada, the numbers of which are not that much far south of the numbers in this much, much greater sized country. And and the reluctance of the government to do anything to alienate the Chinese. So we do have Canadian cabinet ministers coming here and talking about decoupling or friend-shoring, but they don't use that language when they return back up to Ottawa. Right now, we have opinion polls indicating about 80% of Canadians have a negative impression of Canada's relations with the communist regime. But, and we see within the intelligence and security sector a split over how we should be engaging China. As Brian referred to, a massive dump of top secret documents from security agencies in Canada being made public because of concern about the government's lack of response to the reports of the agencies suggesting that there is serious malfeasance going on by the Chinese regime in Canada, including disruption of democratic elections, illegal campaign contributions, kickbacks to people that support China-friendly candidates where they're reimbursed for the non-tax deductible portion of their donation, intimidation of the family members of Canadian legislatures. It just goes on, disinformation against candidates that China doesn't like, none of which the government has been made aware of, but no action up to now has been taken. And it seems that when parliamentary committees try and investigate this matter, the government's reluctant to speak on the basis that these matters are classified and therefore we can't give you the details, but rest assured that everything will be fine. If I could just conclude to say that General Wayne Eyre that Brian referred to has a very different perception of China than our government. And he said something that Miles could have said, which you say that we are both experts on China, but we're not similar. He's in a different category from my humble self. But he said that we must remember that Russia and China do not differentiate between peace and war. The hostile intentions and actions of our adversaries show that they consider themselves to be at war with the West. We must accept this reality and respond accordingly. So this is a very different kind of approach to what we're seeing from the current government. You know, we see a notion that in the government that the growth of China is inexorable. China is vengeful and dangerous if provoked. America is the past. It's a country in decline. China is the future. And so Canada should get with the movement. And as one cabinet minister put it, if you can't beat them, join them. But what we're looking at is China's very substantial influence in Canada through the covert, corrupt, and coercive operations weakens Canadian democracy, security, and sovereignty. It's very difficult to get the government to respond to public and the concerns of our military and intelligence with regard to the reality of what China is doing in Canada in spades. And I think, if I could just say, it's for these reasons that it's hard to make Canada to comply with US-led actions against the Chinese threat. But I do think that it's very important for the security of North America and for the security of the United States, particularly with regard to critical minerals and a potential military threat from Canada, that more attention be paid to this matter and that Canada be given incentive to respond positively to the new mood towards China that we're seeing adopted by the United States, Australia, Great Britain, and other like-minded allies.
Well, those are wonderful opening remarks. I want to turn to Miles now for a U.S. perspective on this. It's very timely, of course, as Xi Jinping and President Biden are heading to San Francisco at this very hour, in fact, for a meeting tomorrow. And here on North America for the first time since going to Mar-a-Lago in 2017, I believe, Xi Jinping. So this is a great time for Canada and the United States to be talking about how do we deal with the China problem. Miles, are we dealing any better with China than what Charles describes in Canada?
I think the summit that's taking place right out here is probably far more meaningful than what's going on in San Francisco. Well, first of all, welcome, Charles, and thank you for those wonderful remarks. As many of you know that I grew up in China, I can tell you with dubious delight, the Chinese Communist Party's most favorite foreigner is a Canadian communist. and his name is Dr. Norman Bethune. So he went to China during World War II, and Mao just loved this guy. And Dr. Bethune, of course, is a very famous, so he's a creator of that MASH, those army, mobile army surgical hospital. Right?
Hospital, yes.
So hospital. So
If I could say, you know, when I was a student in China, we had a shrine to Dr. Bethune in the front lobby of the embassy.
there you go. Yeah. So having said that, let me just say this. Make a brief several points. Number one, we always say the United States is a global power, and that's true. And we have a footprint in every corner of the world, overwhelmingly benign. Therefore, it is intrinsic to American policymaker, to our national interest, to maintain the existing global order, the rules-based international order that the United States has led, but maintained through tremendous partnership with friends and allies over the decades. Right? So China wants to change that. China wants to export its model of governance to replace that global rule-based order with its own communist style of CCP-led community of common destiny for all mankind, of course, under the supreme leader, Xi Jinping. So, and we used to think that we're the sort of the leader and doing all the things. And I discovered with great delight that many countries, they have always have a global footprint, particularly Canada. I'll tell you what, when I was working at the Trump administration, in the Trump administration, one of the issues that we had to deal with was Hong Kong. There was a mass protest, and Chinese passed the national security law, basically demolish the high degree of autonomy. And then we had to deal with the consequences, so we decided to punish their misdeeds for taking away Hong Kong's freedom and autonomy. And to my delight, during the research, I found out, just like the state of Florida, there are more Canadians than Americans in Hong Kong. So the stakes is very, very high. So Canada, we have so much shared interest globally, not just North America, not just the energy, not just about the parochial interests of border and immigration, those kind of issues, but globally, we are in the same boat. And we are part of the Five Eye Alliance, and we're not ignoring Canada. It's like relatives, you know each other so much, the relationship is so solid, sometimes you forget to visit each other more frequently. And that's all. There's no inherent hostility toward a good neighbor, Canada. That's one point. So we have shared global interest to preserve the existing rules-based international order. Number two, I would also say it's very important for us to understand the Chinese Communist Party's main line of propaganda. That is, they try to create a global narrative. That is, all the world's problems are caused by the United States. China now is leading the global crusade against the malign influence of the United States. Therefore, that's why they place such a superficial importance and significance of cosmic level to some talks on the sideline of the APEC between the two leaders, because China wants to position itself to fight against the ultimate source of global instability. That is a very clever ploy. The matter of fact is, China is not just alienating America. China right now is the enemy of much of the world. And that's a problem. So the issue is never just about US and China. The issue is about China versus everybody else. And in this regard, Canada could play a very important role in combating that kind of narrative. We have reached out to many of our friends and allies, not just in North America, but also in other parts of the world. And that's very important to realize this. So do not believe that if two leaders, US and Chinese head of states meet together and all the problem will be solved. Not just a ploy. There's a lot of other problems too. So Europeans now regard China as a systemic rivalry. And you look at some of the major countries in Asia Pacific, particularly along China's periphery. I mean, every country is being bullied or harassed by China. South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Vietnam, Philippines, India, you name it, right? So that's the issue. It's not just about the US versus China. It's about China versus everybody else. So that's a very, very important point where Canada could play a very important role in this to combat that narrative. How? Because a lot of things that the US can do, but many, many things the US cannot do because we cannot take care of everything, right? So it's a partnership. For example, Canada has a very strong presence and active policy in the Arctic Circle, polar region, where China is trying to very rigorous to penetrate. And Russia also is doing something that's pretty unsavory there. So Canada could play a very important role in the Arctic Council, right? So that's something that we are not terribly active in that. We can have a burden sharing and also division of labor. And as friends and partners, we could definitely do that. I have a very good colleague here who's the vice president for development here. He likes to smoke cigar. So we cannot buy cigar from Cuba, but you can. So, but that's kidding aside. I would say another point I want to make is to deal with China, you need global countermeasures. Many of the things should not just be United States warships passaging. For example, freedom of navigation actions, right? We used to have just the U.S. warships passing South China Sea and Taiwan Strait. But now we see increasingly our friends and partners can actually do a lot of things together. I mean, I'm so glad to see that the United States Navy and the Canadian Navy recently jointly passed our joint warships flotilla past Taiwan Strait. Very powerful statement. And I just want to make another thing that Charles mentioned earlier. China normally treats the United States as just ultimate rivalry. It's an enemy. So sometimes they're preparing for the direct showdown confrontation with us for decades. But then in the meantime, they always put an enormous effort to divide US and its chief allies, particularly consider middle countries, that's what Mr. Cronin mentioned, particularly the Five Eyes countries. They put an enormous effort on the United Front from that point of view, and the intelligence penetration. Canada, New Zealand, Australia, even UK, you have seen many cases. So it is very important for US and our friends in North America and in Five Eyes countries in Europe to work on a counterintelligence arena. And that's very important. So we know their methods, those sources, how we can deal with the issue together. So the cooperation future of US-Canada relationship is limitless. Right? We have a lot of process. We just have to communicate more, visit each other more, not just during holidays, but also maybe out of innate goodwill, we should see each other, talk to each other. That's why events like this, two think tanks come together to share thoughts and to have more events like this is so useful, so very good. So I'm really glad to be part of this. Thank you.
Miles, thank you. You've suggested a number of ways that Canada could play an increasingly important role in managing China, but we need to hear from the Canadians what they need from the United States and what, Charles, you think Canada should be doing to stand up to China, because at the same time you're sending forces into the Indo-Pacific, you have very few forces to send. And so when the PLA recklessly conducts maneuvers, it really threatens the Canadian forces. When Wang Yi stands up and threatens journalists in Canada and lectures them on you can't talk about human rights in China, he's treating the Canadians like an insignificant power. So what should Canada be doing to be this sort of robust middle power, the way we've seen Australia and South Korea and Japan and others stand up more recently to China? Canada's doing a lot now. They've recognized this question. You certainly have recognized it for a long time, what China's doing. But what can the United States do to help Canada?
Well, I mean, I think that certainly we need to be more aggressive against China rather than appeasing China. You know, the Canadian external commodities trade to China only amounts to about 4% of what we send abroad. So most of our trading relationship, of course, is with the United States, and particularly border states, compared to Australia, which, you know, might be more like 30%. There is, I think, a false sense within Canada that if we don't comply with the Chinese government's political demands, that they will engage in economic coercion against Canada that will seriously damage our economy. This is a false idea. Chen Duanjie, sitting over there, has written a very good paper, and I may be mischaracterizing it, so let me know. But essentially, you know, our exports to China are primarily minerals and agricultural commodities for which there is a global price. So if China sanctions Canadian soybeans price naturally goes down, and then we open a market elsewhere, which is what's happened with the United States. So I think with Australia, which has been quite successful in countering the Chinese sanctions on some Australian commodities like coal, because they needed the stuff. You know, we had some sanctions by them on, I think, potash, but that one didn't last forever either. I think that we just have to be much more straightforward and honest with the Chinese and not allowing them to intimidate us on this basis. But, you know, because there's so many significant Canadian politically influential companies who have strong connections with the government, who do business with China, and the Chinese regime operating as it does in a comprehensive, coordinated, and strategic way will tell those businesses, well, you know, if your government receives the Dalai Lama next week, for example, you know, we will buy the Embraer airplanes and not the Bombardier ones. And in fact, sometimes they do follow up. So I think that we just have to have more of a backbone, and we do need to get the legislation to reveal the Canadian policymakers who are receiving benefits from the Chinese state. We did have a recent Conservative Party leadership campaign in which an important candidate was a man called Jean Charest, who had been the previous leader of the party when it was at a low point, the Premier of Quebec, and who had been quite active in organizing public opinion and influential decision makers to sign petitions in the newspapers and so on for the immediate release of Meng Wanzhou, who was the Huawei CFO who was being held in Canada pending our consideration of a US extradition request. In the course of the campaign, it turned out that Mr. Charest has been the recipient of a $30,000 a month retainer from the Huawei company. Well, the report is $30,000. Mr. Charest probably didn't reveal the figure, but let's assume that the reports are correct. But he did acknowledge that he had been working for Huawei. He could have become the Prime Minister of Canada if he had not come second in that race. The revelation that he had been receiving the money from the Huawei company was just a blip in the campaign. I mean, for me, it was like, oh my God, you know, he's receiving money from Huawei. But in the campaign, they were more interested in his social policies when he was Premier of Quebec, and this one didn't seem to be really something that grasped the attention of people. So, you know, there is a need for us to be more transparent, more active, more actions, less conversation, and I think more integrated into the common action of the United States, Australia, and Britain in terms of countering China. You know, we are not a member of the Australia, UK, US Indo-Pacific Alliance. We're not a member of the Quad. Why the hell not? I mean, last time I looked at the map, Canada is an Indo-Pacific nation, but United Kingdom, as much as I love the country of my forebears, is not. So why did the US decide to go with that country and not ours? And I think the reason is pretty clear.
Indeed. I'm heading to Ditchley tomorrow to talk with our British, but also Canadian friends about China. I think Canada does need to be part of that discussion. Canada does have an Indo-Pacific strategy, and at least that's a first step toward saying we're turning and pivoting ourselves toward this region. Yeah. Miles, when you think about the challenges that we face from China right now, collectively, what are you most concerned about?
Many things I'm concerned about because I'm by nature a worrywart. Ever since my graduate school, which is okay. So let me just put it this way: we live in a democracy. Democracy means you have freedom of expression. You have many opinions. The opinions basically normally would go to its logical conclusion, which means that people become very opinionated. So it is in that state that the Chinese would come in and to exploit that. I'll give you one example. In the early months of the Biden administration, there was the first significant meeting between the Chinese leaders and American leaders. Yang Jiechi, who was the Politburo member in charge of foreign policy, and Wang Yi, who was then foreign minister, he was obviously lower than Yang Jiechi. So they went to Anchorage, Alaska to meet with the new Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, and our new National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan. And of course, this is the new administration from a Democratic position. And this is after the very tumultuous years of 2020, and so where the American street was on fire, and you have the death of George Floyd. So there was an intense debate about the virtue of American democracy. So people believe there was a systemic problem in this country. That's all part of the democratic debate within the country, right? So if you recall, Yang Jiechi completely broke the protocol at the Alaska conference, and he went on the 10 minutes tirade in front of the world and accusing the United States that his main argument was that Chinese democracy is infinitely superior to American democracy. You have systemic racism, you have inequality, blacks treated very badly. Now, all those were one part of the democratic debate within the United States, who happened to occupy the White House, the American government. So when they say that, there was no effective counter-argument from our part. That's what I'm worried about. Worried about we have lost our confidence in our own institution. If the country, even if during the major argument, you lost confidence, you lose confidence in your own ability to self-govern, you lose confidence in your own fundamentals, that's the end of democracy. So that's what I'm worried about. China is exploring that. So that's why if you look at the summer of 2020, the Chinese foreign ministry is having a field day. I mean, every day they come out to show the videos of George Floyd. The foreign spokesperson will say, I can't breathe all the time. In the meantime, the Chinese government is conducting genocide in Xinjiang and put the entire nation under the most sophisticated, most brutal surveillance, right? So that's the kind of stuff we're dealing with. So we have so many people who bought into that kind of, very much like the 30s or 40s in America, in the deep of depression, we lost confidence in ourselves, our ability to rehabilitate, to self-correct ourselves. So that's something that I worry about. Another issue I'm worried about, this has something to do with Canada. Democracy means that the leaders have to listen to all sides as much as they can. Sometimes there is the loquacious minority. Sometimes there's a silent majority. Silent majority normally don't get their point across. And I'm also worried about this noisy, loquacious minority would hijack the main thrust of our national policy. We have just a few Chinese Americans who are very pro-China in California. They could sway the whole Sacramento to do something that's very, very unhealthy to the interests of the United States, right? I'm going to say this following about Canada. I didn't mean to be critical, but this is as far as I understand. The Canadian government could have handled your dispute with India, a fellow democracy, much, much better.
Sure.
It doesn't have to be just recalling ambassador, have this kind of, as if these were two enemies. Much of that because there's a very large immigrant group in Canada who's from the opposite of current Indian government. And I think the number goes something like 800,000, right? So that's powerful voting blocks. That's a test of leadership and moral courage to stand up for the main interest of the country, for the main interest of a very vital relationship with a major democracy in a region that's vital to global peace. And I believe your leaders screwed up. Okay? So that's what I'm worried about. You ask me about, but this is all like, professorial, but you ask the very professorial question, so I'll give you that answer.
It was a great answer, and you didn't even get to Taiwan. And I want to turn to Taiwan and ask Charles whether this is something that Canada would be supportive of the United States if suddenly we found ourselves dealing with a Chinese blockade of Taiwan. Where does Canada stand on this question of the confrontation over Taiwan's future, especially with this election pending in January?
Well, I don't think that the Canadian government has a position on Taiwan that's clear enough. I mean, certainly at the time of diplomatic relations in 1970, Canada recognizing China at the same time as China was providing weaponry to kill Americans in Vietnam, in the middle of the Cultural Revolution. We had a formula where we took note of the Chinese position, their claim over sovereignty over the island of Taiwan, but Canada didn't have a position one way or the other. I think, if you look at past presidents, and your observation on India, I mean, seeing as we have terrible relations with India right now because of the Prime Minister suggesting that somehow or other the President of India put a gangland hit on a Sikh independentist without providing any basis for this beyond, trust me, that may have been what happened. And then if you look at the Canadian attitude towards the Uyghur genocide, which was a unanimous resolution in the House of Commons condemning China's genocide against the Uyghurs, for which the Prime Minister and the entire cabinet would not vote, the Foreign Minister standing up in the House of Commons and saying, "I abstain on behalf of the government of China, of Canada." Well, actually, he may have meant what I said rather than what I.
But both anyway, always later see.
Yeah. Anyway, so I mean, if you look at Taiwan, the question really is, when push comes to shove, will Canada say, well, Taiwan has a population that's 1/60th that of mainland China. The Chinese ambassador would not like it if we, if we didn't allow China to engage in it, or I guess what one would say, going back to what I said before, if we didn't show strategic empathy to the Chinese position on Taiwan, would Canada back away from joint action? We have, with our very limited military, been assisting in freedom of navigation exercises and some airplanes trying to monitor the North Korean violation of international sanctions. But as I think Miles pointed out earlier, there have been some very close calls. Most recently, a Chinese jet came within 5 yards, as one would say here in the United States, of the Canadian jet. We've had an instance where Chinese ships have crossed dangerously close across the bow of the Canadian ships. Eventually, something's going to happen. I mean, how many times can you have a close call before you have a real hit? I feel, and I'd be interested in hearing what Miles thinks about this, is really it's to foment an incident inside China. When I was a diplomat on my second posting, we had that crash between the American spy plane in international waters and that Chinese pilot, I think his name was Wang Wei. Mm-hmm. And it caused an enormous amount of anger against the United States because Chinese people and most of my Chinese friends believe that the United States somehow or other has some device where they can knock Chinese planes out of the sky, and on purpose wanted to cause the death of this young pilot, to make some kind of point. And obviously that's completely untrue. So if there is an accident there, will this be the precipitating event for us having not only a conflict in the Middle East backed by Iran, but a conflict in Europe backed by Russia, and possibly a conflict in Indo-Pacific simultaneous involving China? You know, and where Canada would come out on it, I don't think, you asked me the question, I wish I was the government of Canada and could give you the correct answer, but I can't.
Well, Miles, on this question of the military-to-military relationship with China, which I know that is going to be on the leaders' discussion list, and they're going to talk about a resumption of high-level mill-to-mill dialogue, but the reckless maneuvers that China is conducting are no accident, right? So how do you view the ability to deal with Chinese maritime forces and air forces that are harassing U.S. and allied and partner forces in the Indo-Pacific?
Okay, so that's a very comprehensive question. Let me try to be as brief as possible. The Americans' predominant way trying to deal with this is through talk with the highest level of Chinese leadership counterparts. So we want to, for example, establish a military-to-military communication line. It's called a hotline. And hopefully that will solve the problem of a very dangerous maneuver in air and on the sea. I think I have very strong doubt that will work, because history has proven that it has never worked. In the 90s and early 20s, we had hotlines. You make a phone call, you have to make sure that the outsider will pick up the phone. So we had hotlines in moments of crisis. Nobody picked up the phone. In 1999, the Chinese embassy in Belgrade was bombed, so it's a crisis. So that's a major crisis. And China just didn't want to pick up the phone. Yeah. President Clinton called him repeatedly, and he went to Cuba to vent, right, his anti-American sentiment. So Jiang Zemin, that's a guy. So he would lead a nationwide anti-American sort of upsurge. This is the beginning of this nation mobilized anti-American sentiment. 2 years later, in the EP-3 plane crash incident that Charles mentioned, the same thing happened. We had an ambassador who was a four-star admiral who had previously been the commander of the Pacific Command. So whose son I taught at the Naval Academy. And the idea we sent him there was to hope that he could establish a very nice relationship with his Chinese counterpart. He did have many friends there in the high command of CMC. When that plane incident took place, nobody would answer his call. That's because we completely misjudged the nature of the regime. Xi Jinping or Deng Xiaoping would never, ever allow the Chinese military commander to have an independent, professional line of communication with counterparts, particularly the United States. That's what they fear most. Even today, if tomorrow President Biden and Xi Jinping sign a deal, hey, we're going to set a military hotline, I can guarantee you, in a time of crisis, nobody will pick up the phone. It would never work. So that's why I think this is a little bit futile. But then it's worth trying, right? It's worth trying. One of the problems is that we have to work this out at different levels. I don't want to perpetuate this stereotype against Chinese drivers. There are a lot of people who have the road rage, very easy to trigger. The Chinese pilots, they are a bunch of, they were easy to develop kind of road rage in air. They do some very unprofessional maneuvers, very dangerous. The way to deal with that is just you set up the line, say, you know what, if you do it again, I'm going to shoot you down, right? And you have to deal with the lowest level, because once that kind of counter measure is taken, then the impact of that will be much, much less than if the leader should make a statement, this is what I ordered to do. So that's why you have to deal with at the operational level. If the ship cut across your bow, you just do something that's very meaningful and consequential, right, to make sure they will never do it again. That's what the Indonesian government did. When Chinese illegal fishing fleet went to Indonesian river the Indonesian government used the order to just sink them. They did. And Chinese fishing ships really go back again. So that's why they're testing our bottom line, our resolve. You have to really constantly deal with this. If we don't deal with it on an operational level, those things can escalate into a major confrontation. That's something that we have to be very careful. Remember, all the major wars were triggered by something that's very minor, right? The Chinese-Japanese War started in 1937. It's because Japanese alleged one soldier went over on the Chinese side and went missing, didn't come back, right? So there's a lot of very good, we do not give China the excuses to escalate. And then the best way to deal with that is at the lower level. You basically make sure that you mean business. I'll give you one example. Russia and the United States had a huge involvement in Syria in the campaign against ISIS, right? So, and the President Obama, we said red line and he didn't mean it, so Russia did something in violation and we didn't do anything, right? So in the Trump administration, we told them, we say, if you do some violation, you have consequences. And so this, we don't believe it, you didn't mean it. So one time, they got a lot of people in the area, in Syria, in the ISIS-infested area, and there's something like 440 of them, right? I believe most of them were Wagner troops. So, but under Russian control. So we called them, are those your people? The Russians, no, they're not our people. And we know they're speaking Russian. Our field intelligence, they're speaking Russian. And they said, we called them again. Are those your people? They said, no, those are not our people. Okay, do you mind if we kill them? Russians say, well, they're not our people. What do you want? And then went in and our gunships killed all of them, 240 of them. Okay, this happened during the Trump administration. It never happened again. Okay, so that's why you have to deal with this. If you tell the Chinese, okay, this is the international space. If you come over here, if your plane trying to intercept us and cause incident, you will bear consequences. We lay out the rule and you deal with it. That would be my answer. So it takes political leadership to make decisions, to give order on that level.
I want to come back to some of the economic and political issues that put U.S. and Canada maybe on a more level playing field here. Charles, and Hong Kong, the crackdown in 2019 has forever now transformed Hong Kong. Hong Kong is something that I think many Canadians have such a close affinity for. Many have come from Hong Kong, the business there as well. How are you thinking about the future of Hong Kong?
Well, I do think that actions speak louder than words, and for that matter, bringing up the Biden interaction with China. I watch the Xinhua, the Enbo, the Chinese news every night, and they talk about, well, we'll make concessions on fentanyl and climate change. Mm-hmm. I'm really wondering what they're expecting Mr. Biden to make concessions on, of more substantive nature. My father was at the Hendon airfield when Chamberlain returned from meeting with Mr. Hitler with the piece of paper. I fear a kind of repeat of this kind of terrible situation. But I think with regard to Hong Kong, I am very, very concerned, and I've had difficulty getting a good response out of the Canadian government. As Miles points out, we have a very large contingent of Canadian citizens living in Hong Kong, something in the order of 300,000 of the 7 million or so are Canadians, and we have a large number of persons of Hong Kong origin in Canada, sort of comparable number, maybe slightly less. I have not been able to get statistics out of the Government of Canada with regard to consular cases for Canadian citizens who were subject to arrest during the various Hong Kong demonstrations. And the Chinese government refers to Hong Kong Canadian passport holders. So their policy appears to be that if it's someone who has origins in Hong Kong, living in Hong Kong, they will not be extended the rights of their citizenship. And I haven't seen any statements from the Government of Canada asserting or demanding that the Chinese government should make a clear indication that Canadian citizens in Hong Kong will be regarded as Canadian citizens. and not as people who have a piece of paper. I mean, as we know from the International Arbitration Court in The Hague ruling on the law of the sea, China tends to discard pieces of paper that say things they don't like as worthless scraps of paper. Will the Canadian passport be upheld? We have, I don't think, been as strong in speaking out on behalf of the violation of the commitments of China to maintain no change for 50 years and Hong Kong people.
For Hong Kong.
Yeah, what, the government?
Hong Kong for Hong Kongers.
Yeah, anyway. Even though they're such an important Canadian group there, probably more than any other foreign nationals, including the United States, Canada doesn't seem to feel that we have any productive role to play. Both the government of the United Kingdom and the government of China asked Canada to endorse the Sino-British Joint Declaration of 1984 when it was sent into the UN, but we don't seem to. Well, China regards that as a historical document of no importance. I wonder how many other documents they regard as, on that basis, but Canada doesn't seem to be, fulfilling what should be our international commitment to at least make some gesture to defend the rights of Hong Kong.
And Miles, you were in a crucial position in the administration when the protests were suddenly, the national security law became everything for the Chinese. I wonder if you could just give an interpretation as to what do you think Xi Jinping's strategy is here? I mean, they've let, in 2002, 2012, and September 2019, every time there were massive protests in Hong Kong, they let them beat a single issue down. But suddenly, that was the extradition treaty when they withdrew it in 2019. But then they said, no more. And everything became an existential issue, and they've completely re-engineered Hong Kong. Why?
Okay, so again, that's a professorial question. I'm going to answer in a professorial way. Let me put it this way. China had this design called one country, two system. And that's the formula designed for Hong Kong, Macau, and mostly for Taiwan. So Hong Kong was kind of trial. It's the model. So if we succeed in Hong Kong, hey, Taiwanese come back, this will work. It's essentially epistemologically flawed because you cannot really work that way. And what China has done is that completely changed the nature of the discourse. Not only about China's credibility, but also about that one country, two systems formula. It's because Hong Kong and Taiwan, from a Chinese perspective, is always a matter of sovereignty, territorial belongings. Hong Kong is part of China. Taiwan is part of China, right? So China actually did not move most ferociously until people in Hong Kong wave American flags until some people say Hong Kong independence, right? That's what they fear most about. But that's a trigger. So the reason that the nature of this policy toward Hong Kong is changed because it changed completely from a matter of sovereignty, whether Hong Kong, Taiwan should belong to China, to one of freedom versus tyranny. The issue about Hong Kong is not about Hong Kongers want to be independent or not. Anybody can say U.S., anybody wants to say that Maryland wants to be independent, but that's just their opinion, right? You have to go through the democratic process, right? Let alone, Canada, Quebec, they want to separate. You have this democratic process, and then that's created more stability, even though it sometimes looks pretty scary, right? So you have to really respect the will of the people. So that's why China could not really tolerate. It's the idea, it's a logical conclusion of the high degree of autonomy. You have autonomy, it must be coupled with freedom and independence of judiciary. So that's why the Chinese system, the one country, two system, could never tolerate that kind of expansion of Hong Kong's autonomy and freedom. Taiwan is the same thing. More and more countries will talk about Taiwan right now in terms of freedom versus tyranny. Is a Chinese communist system is going to overtake a vibrant democracy that has completely transformed itself from dictatorship to the beacon of freedom and democracy in the world. So that's why the world opinion is with Taiwan. That's why you see a lot of European countries are beginning to visit Taiwan. So Americans also go there all the time. The visit between Washington and Taipei is just like endless. I think they should have its own airline. It should be called Panda Express.
Well, as the time is moving on here, I want to move to a sort of a final question or two about. Well, first of all, Charles, you mentioned worried about what President Biden might concede to Xi Jinping. I think my sense is that the administration has been holding off on making concessions, and that the most important pitch that Xi Jinping's likely to make in San Francisco will be over the head of U.S. government, right to CEOs, right to the business community at the U.S.-China Business Council. And we saw at the Shanghai Trade Fair recently a lot of U.S. businesses very eager to hear the message that China's open for trade and investment that Xi Jinping wants to deliver. So if you want to believe it, it's all there. How are Canadians looking at the business prospect right now at a time when even Secretary Yellen had said this is not a great time for investment in China?
I mean, we did see just, I think, last week where China made a massive purchase of U.S. soybeans. It's always part of the strategy to sort of soften things up and then suggest, well, if you're nice to us, maybe we'll favor your companies in investments, or we'll provide you with access to our market that we're not providing to other nations. Canada's a consistent loser in this kind of dynamic. But I think that there still is hope that, Canada, among the pro-China business element and the element within the government that are in their thrall, that things are going to go back to normal, the way they were before Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig were arbitrarily detained, the way they were when Prime Minister Trudeau was trying to negotiate a free trade agreement with China and thought that because Canada's a G7 country, he could add riders on environment, labor, and gender rights, and that China would, say, okay, we'll change the way we do things because we'll have free trade with Canada. I think that there's still remnant hope that there can be a lot of money made in China and that Canada can distinguish itself from other countries that are more hostile to China, and that China will reward that by giving concessions to key Canadian business. And I would suspect that Mr. Xi's charm offensive now is going along the same lines. What concerns me is whether he can get concessions on the sanctions, the trade limitations on U.S. high-tech computer chips and so on, in return for specious promises about how China will, stop producing one coal-fired electrical plant every week in future, and will get into compliance with climate change dogma, in 5 or 10 or 15 years or whatever in the future. But be assured we'll do that, and that we will definitely stop that fentanyl from coming into the United States. I mean, if the factory was producing tracts criticizing Xi Jinping, they'd be closed within 5 hours. But the fact that they're producing fentanyl, I think, appeals to China's notion of, we were weakened by the opium trade, and look what we can do in the United States today. I don't know if people really think that, but it does seem to be a kind of a point where really there's no reason why China should not effectively engage on stopping the fentanyl export, and they don't do it. There was Canada had an agreement with China quite a few years ago. I wrote perhaps one of my most sarcastic of the 230 op-eds I've delivered to Canadian national newspapers over the past 10 or so years, because we gave money to the Chinese police to assist in investigations to try and stop the export of fentanyl from China to Canada, because they said they didn't have the resources to do that themselves, and all the money was being made by drug people in Canada. And we can see how successful that was 10 years later in terms of their responsiveness to our concerns. So maybe I'm a bit too cynical. Maybe even you are more or less cynical than me on China. It's hard to say. But I must say, the more I think about it,
Yes.
the worse I feel.
No, China is the country, at least right now, does not really engender optimism. Well
put.
Miles, where are you on the whole peak China argument, for instance?
The what?
The peak China, that China's reached its peak and that it's, it's actually declining.
That's a good one.
Okay.
This is Michael Beckley.
It's very interesting because if you live through China, China's in the last decades, right? Every single year is the peak for the Chinese, right? The peak keeps, according to Chinese rhetoric, is always going up, right? So I think, if you live in the environment where information is controlled and interpreted to you by the state, and it's really hard for you to make a very correct judgment because you do not have a valid and viable, reliable referential framework. So that's the problem. So the peak, the problem is China has total control of its, if you talk about the comprehensive state power, I think China has significantly weakened because they have their fundamentals challenged. China could benefit tremendously from its full membership in the international free trade system. So they could, they know they're cheating. But then that's why if you listen to the Chinese leadership statement, all the time they say, we have to take advantage of strategic opportunity, 战略机遇. We cannot really afford wasting time. They know sooner or later the world will find out this scam, right? So, and that's why there's a rush to from San Francisco.
Yes, it's the...
Another call from Beijing.
Nobody answered.
Nobody answered. Okay. That's right. Yeah. So that's why I think they are. But ultimately, the system itself would not work. The regime itself really is unpopular among Chinese people. More and more people work with a lot, they lack confidence. So everybody wants to get out. Right now, the most searched words in China on a daily basis is the word 移民, that's immigration. Right? Everybody wants to get visa to foreign countries. And the business in China, they want to get out. So it's hard for me to imagine China representing the future. So that's why I think China is in a steady decline overall, but this is a sharp power you can see. I mean, they're building more ships, building more missiles, building more military hardware. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's very much like Soviet Union, right? Soviet Union, if you look at the Soviet Union, their nukes, their weapons were awesome in the 70s, 80s, or even early 90s, right before the collapse. But the country overall, strategically, is in decline because the country is corrupt. The country itself does not represent the real strength of human condition. That's why I'm ultimately optimistic about the fact that the Chinese model of governance will never be able to prevail. So in a way, they say they're peaking, but then they keep saying they're going up, but I say they're going to decline. They decline in a very long historical perspective. You can see this decline started in the mid-1900s, right? Yes. The Opium War all the way goes down because it's a crisis of Chinese mind, crisis of Chinese institution, and it's a crisis of Chinese identity.
It's a great answer, but I want to end on a more positive note about Canada, Charles Burton, and I wonder if you want to leave the nice, comfortable confines of China watching and talk about why it's important for the United States and Canada to be talking about issues like energy and China.
Well, I mean, we're all one North America, aren't we? And there's so much integration, and there's so much potential for the United States and Canada's wide open country with energy resources, mineral resources, agricultural resources, and if we see a weakening in the polar regions because Russia and China are able to take advantage, maybe in the context of a global war, and start to eat up the north, it starts to come down to the south. And I really don't think that Canada certainly needs to have a continued democratic, strong system based on honesty and integrity and democratic politics. And I think the United States wants a Canada that is compliant with the rules of the international rules-based order and will not be subject to subversion by a power that is hostile to everything that makes America great. So I think from that point of view, we need to be reconsidering why it's so important that we should be better friends and partners. And maybe it's hard to get the attention of Washington for Canada, and maybe Canada retains some remnant suspicion of US intentions. We have to get over it, because this is a new world, and we're facing hostility from Russia, from Iran, from China, and Canada and the United States ought to stand united against a common threat.
Can I
Miles, please, yes.
Okay, so it's very important. Charles mentioned the opinion poll in Canada is about 80% negative rating for China. Yeah. United States is 83%. So Pew conducted the poll a couple months ago in 24 countries. The average negative rating for China is about 67%, and more than 2/3. Now, in some countries, the negative rating for China was the highest, were normally the nicest country, right? Canada, Norway, Sweden. I mean, those countries were they were very nice, but then in each one of the cases, and Japan too. I mean, the unfavorable rating of China in Japan is over 90 now. So I mean, it's amazing. If you believe China is a good neighbor to you in Japan, you'll be considered mentally ill. So I mean, seriously. So right now, the reason is because China always prey on the nice people. Yeah. Canada's been nice on. I mean, it's actually the two Michaels incident woke people up, right? And in Norway, it's because Norway gave a Nobel Peace Prize to the Chinese dissident, Liu Xiaobo, in 2009, 2010. That's how China bullied Norway and just to give Norway a lot of harsh treatment. And Sweden, because there was a bookseller in Hong Kong, he published a biography of Xi Jinping. He's a Swedish citizen out of Hong Kong. The Chinese agent kidnapped him. And sentenced him to long, so he's still in jail. So that's why, because of incident, the Swedish diplomatic establishment tried to deal with China. The way Chinese treated the Swedes was just unbelievably crude and rude, right? And so that's why, essentially, the Chinese way of international engagement is not really that nice, not really that welcome. So that's why we should all work together to realize that United States sometimes have very harsh response to China. It's not because we're intentionally unpolite, right, like the Canadians, because we all share the same adversary who treat everybody equally bad.
I think sometimes, niceness can be naivete. And, maybe Canada has a problem with naivete and greed in terms of our relations with China that we need to put an end to.
Oh, you have some tough guys too, particularly in the hockey field. Yeah.
That's
very good.
That's true.
Well,
a lot of them are Swedes too.
China opens up so many questions. You've addressed a lot of them, and we're very grateful. And I think thanks to Charles Burton and Miles Zhu, we can say that, and thanks to MLI and Hudson, we're working on all synapses now, right? With the China issue, the energy issues. But would you please just join me in thanking Charles and Miles?